All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a pretty massive historical irony from the 19th century British Empire in India. It's a classic story of unintended consequences. We're going to see exactly how oppressive colonial policies, which were entirely designed to extract wealth and maintain total control, inadvertently built a giant nationwide pressure cooker. And the wild part, instead of breaking the spirit of the people, all that immense pressure actually fueled a unified, unstoppable resistance. Here is how we're going to break it down today. We'll start with the spark of nationalism, move on to the price of colonial rule, then look at awakening and communication, check out the precursors to Congress, and finally, wrap up with the birth of the INC. Section 1. The spark of nationalism, and this idea of an age-old consciousness. The concept of being Indian absolutely wasn't something the British just invented. For centuries, the people of the subcontinent actually shared a really deep cultural and spiritual bond. But that inner consciousness, it needed a massive catalyst to transform into a modern, unified political force. And unfortunately for the people living there, that spark arrived in the form of immense hardship and systemic subjugation under 19th century British rule. The conditions changed so drastically that this ancient bond literally had to take on a completely new, forceful expression just for the culture to survive. Moving on to Section 2, the price of colonial rule, or as I like to think of it, building the pressure cooker. And man, this really shows the heat under that pressure cooker, because the exploitation we're talking about wasn't just political, it was deeply, deeply economic. Just imagine your entire local economy flipped completely upside down, pretty much overnight. Before British rule, Indian villages were largely independent, but the raw demands of the British Industrial Revolution completely changed the game. Suddenly, farmers were forced to grow cash crops, things like indigo and raw cotton, just to feed British factories, and they were paid terribly low rates for it. Meanwhile, native Indian handicrafts were basically wiped out because the British slapped huge duties on Indian goods going to England, while simultaneously flooding India with super cheap British-made products. Even the educated youth were trapped. English education was spreading, sure, but all the high-ranking jobs were strictly reserved for Europeans. It pushed a whole generation of really bright, educated Indians straight into unemployment and deep frustration. So, the real kicker here is how these simmering economic grievances were thrown into overdrive by the rapid-fire, honestly brutal policies of Viceroy Lord Lytton. Just take a look at this timeline. Between 1876 and 1878, a devastating famine swept through regions like Madras, Bombay, and Punjab. Lakhs of people died. It was horrific. Yet, right in the absolute middle of this mass starvation, in 1877, Lord Lytton throws this incredibly extravagant Delhi Durbar, costing millions of rupees, all just to declare Queen Victoria the Empress of India. The contrast was just jarring. And when the public outcry inevitably grew, Lytton's government doubled down. They passed the Vernacular Press Act in 1878 to gag local newspapers and immediately followed it with the Indian Arms Act, basically making it a criminal offense for Indians to carry weapons while, surprise, surprise, conveniently exempting Europeans. Part 3. Awakening and Communication. The Unintended Consequences. Okay, this is where the story gets incredibly ironic. The British actually ended up footing the bill for their own downfall. They introduced Western education and the English language simply because they needed a steady supply of low-paid clerks to run their massive administration. They built railways just to extract resources faster. But look at the completely unintended nationalist outcome here. By forcing Indians to learn English, they accidentally gave the educated class a common language, a language they used to share democratic ideals from the French and American revolutions. And those railways? They physically broke down geographical barriers, meaning leaders from totally different regions could finally travel, meet up, and unite. But it wasn't just politics happening here. There was a massive cultural and religious revival going on, too. Educated Indians started applying modern, rational thought to their own society. You had incredible movements like the Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj stepping up. They boldly attacked internal divisions. They fought against the caste system, child marriage, sati, and untouchability. By pushing for real social equality, they were actually forging a society that could stand united. Plus, to fight back against this British narrative that Indians were somehow backward, reformers started translating ancient texts. They highlighted India's glorious past achievements in science, math, and philosophy. And that powerfully restored the people's self-confidence. All of this renaissance gave rise to a totally new group of people. Historian P. Spear hit the nail on the head when he said, the new middle class was a well-integrated all-India class, a dynamic minority. It had a sense of unity of purpose and of hope. This brand new urban middle class, teachers, lawyers, businessmen, journalists, they truly understood modern democratic institutions. A lot of them had even traveled to places like England or France and seen free societies up close. They quickly became the absolute vanguard, the leaders of the modern nationalist movement. So how exactly does this dynamic minority get the word out to the masses? The press. By the end of the 19th century, we are looking at roughly 500 newspapers and journals in circulation across India. Papers like the Amrita Bazar Patrika in Bengal and Bal Gangadhar Tilak's Kesari in Marathi became absolute game changers. They reported on colonial misrule, they popularized political programs, and they built this massive interconnected network of political awakening. All right, Section 4, the precursors to Congress, organizing the outrage. We've got all this pressure building, this cultural awakening, these new communication networks. But let's be real, raw anger and a few newspaper editorials don't dismantle an empire. It's a logistical nightmare when you really think about it. So how on earth did a vast, historically divided place like India actually channel all that unprecedented outrage into a formal, working political body? The answer? Step by step. Before the famous Congress even existed, you had these brilliant regional pioneers laying the groundwork. Dadabhai Naoroji, often called the Grand Old Man of India, founded the East India Association all the way over in London in 1866, just to directly voice Indian grievances to the British public. Back in India, Justice M.G. Ranade founded the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha in 1870 to secure relief for cultivators. And crucially, in 1876, Surendranath Banerjee established the Indian Association in Calcutta. That was perhaps the most direct predecessor to a national body, and they were actively launching agitations against Lord Lytton's oppressive acts. These groups were literally teaching the entire nation how to organize. Which brings us to Section 5, the birth of the INC, the ultimate release valve. So, December 1885, Bombay. The pressure cooker finally pops the release valve. But get this, the catalyst for it is probably the biggest irony of the whole story. The Indian National Congress was heavily championed by a retired British civil servant named Alan Octavian Hume. With the blessing of the British Viceroy, Hume actually wanted to create a harmless safety valve, a peaceful little venting space so the British could avoid another massive violent uprising. Well, spoiler alert, the valve worked a little too well. At that very first session, they weren't calling for an outright war. No, they were meticulously building a nation. Their goals were super clear. Enable national workers from all over the country to actually know each other personally, put an end to racial, religious, and provincial prejudices, formulate popular opinion on vital problems, and integrate the people based on common political tenets. Honestly, it was an absolute masterclass in democratic organization. And man, the momentum was just off the charts. Literally, just look at these numbers. The first session in 1885 had a modest 72 delegates. Exactly 1 year later, that number exploded to 406. By the third session in 1887, they were up to 607 delegates. This framework that the British genuinely thought would just be a harmless vending space was rapidly snowballing into a massive, highly organized national parliament. Well, you can probably guess what happened next. The British government's friendly, supportive vibe totally evaporated, almost overnight. Because as the Congress grew in strength and confidence, they actually started demanding real administrative reforms. The British quickly realized their little safety valve was a highly effective political engine. So Viceroy Dufferin and the colonial government did a complete 180. They suddenly started mocking the Congress, calling them nothing more than a microscopic minority. They barred government officials from attending and actively encouraged reactionary elements to fight back against the Congress. But you know what? The damage to that colonial grip was already done. The shared economic suffering, those totally unintended gifts of English education and railways, and the tireless work of social reformers had literally forged a nation out of a subcontinent. The pressure cooker had successfully released into this brilliant, structured organization. But that leaves us with a pretty massive question to ponder. Would this newly formed group, mocked by the British as a mere microscopic minority, actually have the strength, the endurance, and the strategic genius to eventually dismantle the largest empire in human history? Well, we are definitely going to have to explore that next time. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.